This is Emily Geddes.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And this is the Hidden History of Business. In the course of this podcast, we have talked about several different types of alcohol and several different areas of the world where alcohol is made or drunk.
And everybody, wherever you are, using the materials that are at hand.
So in Japan, where rice is very common, they ferment rice water and it becomes sake. Or in the Americas, they have a lot of corn and maize, and so that became the base for their alcoholic beverages in the early native populations. There's also grapes in Greece and grains in the Fertile Crescent. But basically every culture, every society took what they had a lot of, and used fermentation to turn it into an alcoholic beverage for preservation, for fun, for enjoyment.
And for food.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk today about one of the oldest alcoholic beverages that we know of, and that is mead. The base of mead is honey.
The honeybee originated about 1 million years ago. That's from DNA studies. The bee in Africa basically finding crevices or cracks or cavities in trees that had been created by the elephants feeding on the trees. They'd tear off part of the tree and create a cavity that would be rotted out, and then the bees would go in there and create their hive. Well, somewhere between 20 and 40,000 years ago, the natives began to realize that these honey hives that were created would also collect water, and the water and the honey would then ferment, and then you would have this wonderful tasting drink, which we now call mead.
Now, Africa wasn't the only place that this was. As populations moved out of Africa or to other areas, they would often bring bees with them and the resultant honey. So mead made its way around the world. They've found evidence of mead in the chemical signature of mead in Asia, in northern China, as far back as 7000 BC. They've found descriptions of mead in hymns of the Rig Veda, which is a Hindu holy text, dated around 1700 BC. It was talked about in ancient Greece. It was said to be the preferred drink of the gods that descended from the heavens as dew before being gathered in by the bees. Aristotle talked about mead in his writings. Pliny the Elder talked about mead in his. The Spanish-Roman naturalist Columella gave a recipe for mead in about AD 60, where he talks about taking rainwater kept for several years, mix a certain amount of this water with honey, or if you want a weaker mead, mix this amount of water with this amount of honey, expose it to the sun for 40 days, and leave it on a shelf near the fire. And if you don't have rainwater, you can boil spring water instead.
So a mead is very simple, as this recipe shows. You just need honey, you need water, and you let it sit for a while.
Yep, which is probably one of the reasons it was so common all over the world.
Right.
The Old English epic poem Beowulf, I think we've mentioned it in an earlier podcast, but they talk about how the warriors there drank mead. Most Celtic and Germanic cultures, mead was a heroic drink. Any of the epic poems that you read will talk about the warriors, the heroes, drinking mead.
And the drink of Valhalla was mead. So if you died in a heroic fashion, and you went to your paradise of Valhalla, you got to drink mead.
Oh, goody. So, like many other things, the monasteries in Europe actually became a center for mead. And the reason why is really quite interesting. Mead was a byproduct of the fact that these monasteries needed candles. And to make candles, you needed to have beeswax. And to have beeswax, you needed to have bee colonies close at hand. So when you have bee colonies close at hand, and they are creating the waxy honeycomb, they're also producing the honey. In order to make the candles, they had to extract the beeswax by crushing the honeycomb and then rinsing all of the honey out. So you'd end up with your clean beeswax to make candles, and you'd end up with a whole bunch of honey water.
And that honey water was what became mead.
So not only did the monks now have this source for their own enjoyment, but they could sell it. They could open restaurants or taverns to sell it to other people.
So you had all that. The importance of mead in the Middle Ages is illustrated by the fact that if the king's mead cellar was always under the direct care of the steward of the household, which is essentially the COO of the household. He was the person in charge of running the household.
Mead makers could charge as much as 1/3 of the mead that they made for their customers. And Queen Elizabeth had her very favorite recipe that included, along with the honey, the fermented honey water, rosemary, bay leaves, sweetbriar, and thyme.
Which is not uncommon to add herbs because that is also how they use mead as a medicine.
For a whole bunch of different ailments.
Yes. In fact, the term medicine actually comes from the Welsh word for mead with spices in it.
So we've got these two products in high demand. We've got the beeswax and we've got the honey, and they are inextricably linked. So in 1865, Austrian Major Francesco de Hruška invented a centrifugal honey extractor that supposedly he came up with the idea for after watching his son swing a bucket of honey around his head. But once they were able to extract the honey more thoroughly from the beeswax and get a cleaner product from the beeswax, there was less honey to rinse out of it.
And hence less mead.
So they had their beeswax, they had their honey separate, but they didn't have that byproduct of the honey water that made mead.
At the same time, though, as you go farther north, you see people are coming up with other types of fermentation products. In the southern Europe, Greece, for example, wine becomes the dominant alcoholic drink because it's easier to produce. As you get farther north, grains become more popular.
And so you start to have the beer and the ale.
Yes. And it's so where you end up with the Scandinavian countries being sort of like the last to really get in on that. That is where you have a lot of the legends about mead. And in fact, we were talking about Valhalla. That is associated with the Vikings and Scandinavia. Mm-hmm. So you have Scandinavian countries providing us with a lot of the mythology of mead, because the other cultures have basically moved away from it by this point.
So even in today's society, in our Western culture, mead still has a little bit of an influence that you might not recognize. There is an interesting connection between mead and marriage. I want you to think about a common term associated with weddings and marriage, the honeymoon. Now, the honey part refers to mead. Especially in Scandinavian cultures, a great deal of mead was drunk at weddings. After the ceremony, couples were traditionally given a month's supply of mead to help start them on their way. But this was also a very common idea in many different cultures. French, Spanish, Italian, Polish, Russian, Hebrew, Arabic, Persian. In the Hungarian language, the term translates as honey weeks. But this idea of a period of time after the wedding, it goes through many different cultures. The first recorded description of the word was in 1542 from Samuel Johnson, and this is a direct quote. He says, "The first month after marriage, when there is nothing but tenderness and pleasure, originally having no reference to the period of a month, but comparing mutual affection of newly married persons to the changing moon, which is no sooner full than it begins to wane." So while honeymoon, the term honeymoon has a very positive connotation today, it was actually kind of a warning to people that the sweetness, the honey of this first period of their happy, joyful marriage together would soon wane.
A large part of this goes back to the fact that marriage anciently has been not about romance. In fact, that is a modern concept that people marry because they're in love. Back to the ancients. You don't get married for love because marriage is a business proposition.
It's about property. It's about ensuring inheritance rights of your children.
That you would be able to control the property and then add to it because the wife would bring in a dowry. And so you always wanted to marry someone who was going to add to your wealth and not subtract from it. But this also led to various different ideas of how you deal with that period at the wedding and just afterwards. Because what you want to do is take these comparatively two strangers and give them an opportunity to bond together so you have a lasting marriage. The last thing you want is what happened to good old Attila the Hun. In his last marriage, he got roaring drunk, went to take his wife, his new wife, to bed, and according to legend, he either died from the excessive drinking or he was so drunk that she was able to strangle him with her hair.
Yes, that's generally not considered a successful honeymoon.
No.
True. The very earliest honeymoon origins, including but not only Scandinavian, are not quite as pleasant as hopefully most honeymoons are today because they involved kidnapping.
It would be very common for a man to spy a woman in another village and kidnap her. Go and hide the woman until her family would stop looking for her.
Or until she became pregnant, at which point the marriage couldn't be annulled. Well, in order to keep her more calm, less resistant, sometimes alcohol was used.
Actually, this goes back to the Norse tradition that the word for the honeymoon actually is derived from a word that means in hiding. So
you don't want to try to pronounce that?
No, I don't.
Hunotsmanather.
Easy for you to say.
Sure. Now, another aspect of the mead. I mentioned earlier that a month's worth of mead was given to the couple to drink immediately following their marriage.
Well, it goes back to the idea that mead was a special drink. I mean, it's a drink of the gods. And so it was also the drink of love. You'd give the mead to the couple to encourage them to be in love with each other. It also had the additional benefit that if the bride drank mead in the first month and became pregnant, she was more likely to have a male child. In fact, if she did have a male child, based on that first month, the mead maker who made the mead would actually be given an extra gift. So they'd make more money. And it even gets to the point where if the cup that they drank the mead out of, if that produced a male child, that cup got handed down in the family as, hey, this is the cup that you want to use to drink the mead in that first month because you're going to have a male child, which is important for the inheritance.
But would it really, would mead really have an effect on fertility and on the sex of the child?
Actually, there is a medical basis for that.
Really?
Because mead will change the acidity and the sweetness of the drink can influence body acidity, which can affect the selectivity of the sperm, which kind of favors the male sperm over the female sperm, and so you're more likely to have a male if you drink mead.
Interesting.
And there's a small statistical probability of that.
Well, moving on chronologically, trying to get us a little closer to today's understanding of the term honeymoon, starting in early 19th century Europe, particularly Great Britain, upper-class couples would often take a bridal tour after getting married. They would not generally go alone. They would generally be accompanied by friends or family, and the purpose was to visit relatives who weren't able to come to the wedding.
And you see this, for example, in the writings of Jane Austen, like Pride and Prejudice, where the couples are going to go off at the end, if they're happily married. Well, they went to visit family who couldn't be at the wedding.
So it was very common, especially for those in Great Britain, to go visit the continent. And so these bridal tours, they were usually taken by the wealthy upper classes, and they lasted for weeks or months at a time. And this continued during early Victorian times, but towards the end of the 19th century, we started developing something a little closer to what we understand today. Couples started going off by themselves for the purpose of bonding.
Well, you actually had a change in the political environment. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the balance between France, Prussia, or Germany, as it would become, and Italy and Great Britain and Spain established a period of relative peace between them. There was no wars in Western Europe after the Franco-Prussian War until the Great War, 1914. People did more traveling. It was also a period of prosperity so that the middle class started having more money so they could go and travel. Part of that was these honeymoons that middle-class couples would take, and instead of visiting family, they'd go someplace exotic to have their honeymoon period where they could get to know each other. Because again, supposedly, you had no contact really between the bride and groom until their wedding night. Now, doctors at the time were not in favor of this. They considered women that might be too fragile for a period of time when they'd be alone with their husbands, and we know what's going to happen then. And that'd just be too much for them. Especially when you go to places like the French Riviera or Italy. In fact, the movie, A Room with a View.
Oh, yes.
Is all about that. That's how it ends. They go off to where they met, a room by themselves, a room with a view. So what you would have is the couple would get married, and then during the reception, they would then leave and either get on a train or a boat and go off on their honeymoon. Now, this trend would also move over to the United States. Now, in the United States, the most popular destination for a honeymoon was Niagara Falls. And this is true up until, 1950s. I remember movies, one that Marilyn Monroe was in, about couples going to Niagara Falls for their honeymoon.
So this became much more of a a middle-class expectation, not only upper class. We're moving socioeconomically kind of down the scale, and it's broadening for
more and more
people.
Yes.
Sure.
So, and that's what you see quite often. A lot of times the upper class will adopt something, then it kind of works its way down the class structure.
So today, honeymoons are big business. We found some statistics that the average couple spends almost $4,500 on their honeymoon, but luxury honeymooners can spend up to $10,000 on their honeymoons. This is a significant chunk of change. There's a total of $72 billion spent on weddings annually in the U.S.
And that's weddings, not the honeymoon.
Right. This
is big business. And again, it goes back to the fact you have these ancient origins. But the modern consequences today that we live with is that it's a business and that people are addressing that business as an economic opportunity to provide the services. You have couples who it becomes the expectation. You're going to get married. You're going to go on a honeymoon. It's changed a little bit. Today, we don't get on ships for the most part. We get in cars or we get on airplanes.
Well, the top 3 honeymoon destinations within the U.S. now are Hawaii, which you'd still have to fly or get on a boat to, Florida, and Las Vegas.
Yes.
Mine was in the middle of Bend, Oregon, which is not quite as exotic, but it worked for us.
Mine was in western Colorado, in the Rockies. You don't have to go to Florida. You don't have to go to Hawaii. You don't have to go to Las Vegas.
And you don't even have to have Mead.
But it might make it more fun.
If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find snark, updates, and behind-the-scene peeks of production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.